Welcome to Casey Cares, the voice of Kansas City nonprofits. We put in business sectors to enhance the quality of life right here in Kansas City for both our residents and our visitors. This Casey Cares segment is brought to you by the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation, www.kaufman.org. I'm Ruth Bonvigus. Volunteering to serve on the board of a nonprofit organization can be deeply meaningful and rewarding. Yet many people discover that board service involves far more responsibility and insight than they expected once they take their seat at that table. For this month's Ask the Expert episode, we've invited two experienced professionals to explore the breadth and depth of board service, what it really entails, and how volunteers can make the greatest impact and get the most out of the experience. Please welcome our own Dr. Philanthropy, Jeffrey Byrne, along with Lisa Pelofsky, a respected fundraising consultant. Both bring decades of experience in the nonprofit sector, including extensive board leadership and service. Well, welcome to both of you. I'm so glad we could coordinate this.
Thank you, Ruth. It's good to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. I love any opportunity to hang out with Jeffrey. And Ruth, of course, you as well.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, Lisa, I have to be quite honest. It was a post I saw of yours on LinkedIn that really inspired me to have us dig into this. We've done shows about, what should you look like for somebody on your board and those things. But I thought this was worth, knocking down and talking about. Maybe the best places to start is summarize what your post was on LinkedIn.
I believe that you were referring to the one where I said the title was Board Service is Not for Everyone. And I was sharing my thoughts that in sort of the last maybe decade or even the last 5 years, there's been sort of a shift in the way that people have perceived these board positions. And frankly, it's disconcerting because the idea of service is that it's a selfless act and that you have reviewed kind of your own personal situation, whether it's financial or other, to make sure that there's no conflict. And that in my opinion, it's one of the highest callings. However, what we've seen is a lot of scenarios, whether they're appointed to a public board or a private foundation board, where compensation occurs or there's benefits that are accrued by the board member as a result of their access to the decision making. And frankly, it has been troubling to me. And I, from my own personal experience, I know that there's a certain level of commitment around that kind of service. And I think that if you agree to serve in those roles, it's really important that you do so without an intent to benefit.
Jeffrey, hop right in here. Let's define board service. And there's a number of components that are wrapped into that.
Yeah, I agree 110% with what Lisa just said, is that to be on a board is really a selfless act, or it should be. I know that Lisa serves on boards. You serve on boards, Ruth. I currently serve on the Vail Valley Foundation board. I serve on the Parsons Dance Company board, and I serve on the Vail Dance Festival board. And in each one of those, my responsibility is to sort of be like mission focused. So to help promote the mission of those organizations is to understand what my fiduciary responsibilities are as well. Mm-hmm. So that I'm not overstepping. As a consultant and as a fundraiser, I'm a doer. But as a board member, my role is to advise and to donate and to provide activities as requested by the CEO or other members of the staff through the CEO. I also understand, so I'm not a manager, you know. Uh,
Mhm.
I also understand that I've got to be prepared. And, as a fundraiser and as a consultant, I'm prepared. I do my homework, I come prepared, and then I lay out and I implement and follow up. As a board member, however, I understand that I do things at the last minute sometimes. Before the board meeting, I try to look at the last board meeting notes and think about what my responsibilities were to make sure I've checkmarked those. And then I try to be prepared, not always doing a great job. So I evaluate myself as a board member, just like I evaluate other board members that Lisa and I work with. It also takes us working collaboratively with staff so that, because many times staff are going to come to us and ask us certain questions, and we want to be respectful of them, but we also want to make sure that they're going through the chain of command at the different organizations. As a board member and as a fundraiser, I am involved in fundraising with the boards I'm on. However, I just started doing that about 5 years ago. For the first 20 years of my fundraising career as a consultant, I never would get on any boards in communities where I serve as a consultant or a professional fundraiser. Now that I'm out, I'm doing this in Vail, Colorado, and in New York City. So I feel like I can do that and then keep good to my pledge that in greater Kansas City or elsewhere in the Midwest, that I can provide services where I am professionally and I am giving back in a different way than I am in other communities.
Lisa, I want you to pick it up from there because you do serve on boards here in Kansas City where you do work. And I know you work outside of the community as well. But how how do you balance that board service? How does that make your board service any different than from what Jeffrey's talking about?
Um, I think Jeffrey made some great points. I think we have to be careful because there have been times where the organization would come to me and say, "Would you consider bidding on something, or would you, review this, or or weigh in as a, as a contractor?" And I've thus far the answer has always been no. I won't do that. I'm happy to volunteer my time, but I'm not going to represent the organization, especially not while I'm on the board, because it implies a lot of different conflicts, including, well, how did she get that role versus, why wasn't it put out for bid? Why did her company have that, role? And I see a lot of organizations where, for instance, there's people that serve on the board who are the decision makers, and family members and relatives, businesses, and others get the business for the organization, and to me. It makes me very uncomfortable, that unless there was clearly a process to disassociate yourself from that decision making,
Mhm.
you see it time and again that these contractors, have uncles and cousins and whomever on those boards, and then they're the ones with the lucrative contracts. Um, while that could be very well intended, and that was maybe they were a single source, or maybe there was a million reasons why that happened, at the end of the day, the appearance is that it's inappropriate. So, I sort of defer to the idea that let's be super cautious about what we agreed to work on and where we spend our volunteer time so that there aren't those instances of conflict. And not that we don't all know how some contracts are awarded, somebody's relative, or somebody has better access than somebody else, et cetera, et cetera. But you hope that that those conflicts don't, aren't perpetuated throughout the process. That there's objectivity, because at the end of the day, that it's your credibility. And frankly, there's plenty of business out there. You don't need to, you don't need to have business where your family members are serving, et cetera. And if that's the case, then perhaps those family members recuse themselves or remove themselves from those roles, and you just don't see that happening. So I think at the time that I wrote this, there was a number of incidences in the community that I really took issue with, that were not just an appearance of a conflict, but clearly a financial benefit that somebody was gaining as a result of that service. And I just think that it's not necessary, and it also in a lot of ways reduces trust in institutions. And I think we're having a very difficult time in our country with trust around institutions, whether it's government institutions, educational institutions, or other. And so any of those appearances, I think, lend themselves to the idea that you can't trust anyone, that we'd be better off without these governing bodies or these organizational institutions. And I don't believe that's true. I believe that these institutions are part of what makes this country a great nation, and that we have to work hard to preserve them.
Trust. We hear that a lot, especially that it's an important thing. I don't know, venture to say more important even for our nonprofit organizations. Jeffrey, I wanted to come back to something you talked about. You mentioned, managing and the role of a board member and their service with staff. Should it just be, hands off? How do you manage the manage?
It's a good question, Ruth. And, I, for years, for the first 20 years, as I mentioned, as a consultant, I wouldn't provide my services without a fee. But I decided 5 years ago that as long as I would be on boards outside of Kansas City and my consulting area, that I could do that and I could provide my services then for free. And what I found in the first board I served is that I overstepped, I got a little bit too involved as a manager versus as a board member to give advice. So I learned quickly that, they appreciated the advice I gave, but they didn't want me to be following up and explaining to them and checking on them and making sure that they had implemented what that we had talked about. And of course, as Lisa and I are fundraising consultants or grant writers or, advisors to CEOs of nonprofits and directors of development, we get involved in the nitty-gritty of what's going on in the organization and provide insight. That's not what some of the organizations are interested in board service. So that was a clear aha moment for me as well. Also, another aha moment has been that, we are asked for gifts. And a lot of times, as a board member, and when you're recruiting a board member, nonprofits will ask, they won't even say that you have to give or that you have to go out and help open doors or introduce others to your organization or get money for them. And I find that is, or they'll have a 15-point checklist, Ruth, and the very last point will be, and fundraising, and, most nonprofits, at least 50 or more percent of their overall revenue are going to come from philanthropy. So I found being upfront about philanthropy and what your responsibilities are as it relates to fundraising is very important. And, Lisa and I both have a commitment to give back. We give back to all the clients that employ Lisa or myself in the fundraising, consulting, grant writing area. And, so I made a policy, and I believe Lisa has the same thing years ago, that I wouldn't give to capital campaigns or major gifts. But that's what I do most of my consulting for. But I would get back to a special event, to a golf tournament, to some type of activity that would benefit the organization, but not be in the area of where I felt like I had the strongest ability to make an impact. Because if I had done that, I would probably have 100 different pledges over, a 4 or 5 year period that we were giving to. So, we make this as a profession for ourselves and make a good living, but we also believe in service and giving back. And I think that when I'm thinking about serving on a board or talking to prospective board members, the core fundamentals of best practices are what I try to focus on in my conversations and their explanations and questions of what they are expectations for them as well.
We're talking with Jeffrey Byrne and Lisa Pelofsky. They are our experts. We're trying to crack the nut on board service. Lisa, Jeffrey mentioned that, some nonprofits will bury, and oh, by the way, we want you to make a donation. And I've worked within nonprofits and on boards, and it always seems like it's this really delicate, they want to just dance and not make it so front and center. Why is that?
Yeah, we've been asking ourselves that for decades. It's almost as if there's sort of this shame factor around philanthropy that in some way it's demeaning or it exposes some vulnerability that you're asking for a donation. And I think it's a huge problem if a board member hasn't given and then they're advocating to their friends and colleagues, to make a donation to the organization in which that they've never given themselves. So there's a lot of reasons why board members should be the first solicited and the first gifts. And one is just the credibility. A lot of the grant applications now will ask you what percentage of your board gives. And the answer is it needs to be 100% of your board that gives. I think it goes back to that notion that, why would a funder give to your organization when you, who sits on the board and knows the organization intimately, hasn't made that gift? What is it that you know about the organization that's preventing you from being philanthropic, and why, how does that affect the funder who you're soliciting? And I think it's an excellent question because we know the organization best. And, we're the closest to the organization and we govern the organization. We're responsible for the organization. So if we're not investing, what it brings up a number of issues around, well, what's the problem? I think that when organizations tiptoe around the request, that they're doing a disservice to their own mission, and that in many ways it undermines their efforts to fundraise.
Well, I think both your comments raise the three words I often hear in circles: your time, your talent, and your treasure.
Right.
So if you're looking to serve on a board, you should have an expectation you will be asked to support some way financially. Now, it's interesting. I also have seen boards get away from, you will give 20%, or you will give, I know in churches there's tithing and they are nonprofits, but in a different kind of a category. When did the whole phrase of give a meaningful gift, and what should somebody on a board, take away from that? How do you make that decision as to what's meaningful?
I think too, that really varies from person to person. At different times in my life when the economy was not as strong as other times, I hear people saying, well, I can't really make a gift this year. We didn't do that well, et cetera, et cetera. But meanwhile, you know that person and you know that their lifestyle hasn't changed any. So they're not eliminating vacations. They're not eliminating that kitchen remodel. They're not getting rid of that sports car, but they're more than willing to give up philanthropy. And to me, I think it's just a matter of prioritization. And so I think for the nonprofit organizations and for religious institutions and others, the idea is, how do we help people understand that this is every bit as important as your 2-week timeshare in Palm Beach? This is a commitment that sends a message, and that message is really important. It's a message, and I've gone round and round with people who I've thought needed to be more participatory in philanthropy. And I point blank said to them, what's your legacy? How many cars can you own? How many houses? How many vacation homes? What is your legacy for your family and your children? Is it that, oh, he was a great guy, fun to party with, but didn't understand charitable giving and wasn't willing to make any sacrifices for others? And to me, I think I'd be mortified if that was what people described as my legacy. That and to be fair, I'm an antique car collector, and I have lots of toys and cars that I play around with all the time. But I also, I don't buy a car in lieu of giving to my favorite charity. I still manage to do both. And try to balance those things. And I think it's important that we teach our children that it's a balance, and that feeding your soul doesn't just entail electric windows and driving at high rate of speed, but it also entails having satisfaction for the work that you've done and seeing how it's valued in the community.
Great. I'm going to switch gears on us here, because I had done a little research and I was coming up with a checklist. I think one area we haven't talked about is kind of strategic planning and the vision that becomes part of board service. Jeffrey, can you talk about that a little bit? And what does that mean? If I'm on the board, am I going to have to come up with the strategic plan?
Well, I think helping to provide oversight and guidance and being participatory in what the vision is really important in nonprofits. Of course, Lisa and I don't go to a nonprofit to really be engaged on large projects unless there is a vision and unless there is a strategic plan that has the board has gone through. And many times that means that they have literally perhaps taken the organization apart from an organizational standpoint and a mission and a vision standpoint and a core value standpoint. And they put it back together. They might have updated it. They might have revised it. They might have deleted some areas. And that that process sometimes can take months to a few years. Or, a good quick SWOT analysis, looking at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and then repositioning the organization according to, the conclusions of those 4 SWOT factors, and then putting not only the core areas together, but then the areas of tactics, objectives, and goals as well. So I think a lot of times that is a process that some boards feel like, oh my gosh, it's overwhelming. I know I served on a board in out of town where we took 10 months to put a strategic plan together. We hired a consultant who was a strategic planning expert, and we had various committees, and over a 10-month period, we rolled all these conversations up into a plan, presented that to our board of directors, and then for a year, our staff did nothing with it. And it was like a shelf document.
Oh, boy.
Myself and my co-chair of the committee got very frustrated about that. And we voiced that frustration as well. But after a year, the organization felt like it had the resources and the staff time to then start to implement it. And I will say they have done a few pieces of the overall plan, and I think that's important. I feel like, the worst thing you can do is go through a process of putting together a strategic plan, wasting a lot of volunteer time, and then just having a shelf document. Funders aren't asking for shelf documents that are plans. I've never heard of, even doing major campaigns. I don't hear of, oh, could we see your strategic plan? No, what they want to do is hear from, the CEO about what his or her vision is, why others are supporting it, and how that fits into the community and its needs, and then how they might be able to help. So I think strategic plans are very important. They can be very complicated or they can be very simple, depending on what the brand of the organization is and also what the task ahead is that is needed.
So our experts here have said, you should anticipate guiding policy, meaningful or some kind of a financial contribution to the organization that you are serving on, making sure there's trust and not inappropriate relationships in terms of connections on a board to maybe staff or whatever. We only have a couple minutes left. What does board service not include?
Free lunch. It was funny. Before I ever served on an appointed board, my father, who is so wise, and I'm very lucky. I have both parents that have advised me over the years, and they have extensive experience around this. But my father said to me, "Remember, you are not there to make friends. You are there to do a job and not receive some gratification or glory, etc., some award, some compensation. You're there to do work." And I really took that to heart and tried to make sure that I never was in a position where in some way I was receiving a benefit from that role. And I think these roles do have benefits, certainly, and they have prestige and other kinds of things. However, it really comes with a lot of responsibility. So I would just say that what you're not supposed to do are all the things that would, had the public found out, embarrass your organization and yourself.
Jeffrey, we got a moment left. Last words.
Yeah, and I think, my rule about board members have been consistent over the 37 and a half years I've been doing fundraising, either as a practitioner or as a consultant. And that is, a third of your board members will do exactly what you ask. A third won't do a damn thing, but they'll come and eat that lunch that Lisa just mentioned. And a third will do more than you've ever asked. So as my mentor, Beth Smith, God bless her soul, would have said, hug them and love them up, Jeffrey. Those 2/3 that do something for you and more than you ever ask. So thank you, Ruth.
Thank you, our experts on board service. I appreciate your time and your wisdom.
Thanks, Ruth.
Thank you for joining us for KC Cares, Kansas City's nonprofit voice, and we're produced by a nonprofit called Charitable Communications. This KC Cares segment was brought to you by the Ewing, Marion Kaufman Foundation, www.kaufman.org. You can spread the love and find us on Facebook and Twitter at KC Cares Radio and on Instagram at KC Cares Online. And don't forget, Saturday mornings, you can catch us at 8 a.m. on ESPN 1510 a.m. and 94.5 FM. Thank you for joining us on KC Cares.